Let's turn now to Larry Johnson, former CIA officer who was a deputy director of the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism under the first President Bush. Larry, thanks again for some of your time tonight.
Good evening, Keith.
The mechanics of this. You got dozens of surveillance cameras blanketing this area. Might be the most photographed area in the world as the cars are parked. There's 50 gallons of gas in the first car, camper-sized canisters of propane, meaning they're used by campers, and some nails. What happens if you actually manage to spark this device?
It's going to do a lot of damage to the interior of the Mercedes, but this is not one of the car bombs or truck bombs we see going off in Iraq. I mean, what's really striking about this, Keith, is today you had 2 non-bombs in London, and we had at least 5 bombs in Baghdad in which U.S. soldiers were killed in one of those. So it's just, I think it's sort of out of proportion. This was an incendiary. This was not a high explosive.
I've read and heard nothing in any of the coverage here, nothing in these news conferences about a detonating device apart from a cell phone. What was supposed to cause this thing to blow up? Because if we can put together car bombs with half a tank of gas and some propane and an old cell phone, then every drunken Hollywood starlet is a potential car bomber,
right?
Isn't she?
Well, I think the fuel, the petrol, the 50 gallons, if you set that on fire, that fire can spark an explosion in a propane tank. But I've seen those go off, and when they go off, it's an enormous boom. It splits the tank, but you're not going to get fragments and projectiles like a hand grenade going off. So you wouldn't want to be in the car when it happened, but, you know, if somebody was within, 20, 30 feet of it, they would have ear damage, but not much more.
So we're not talking about shrapnel then?
Correct. This is not a shrapnel-causing device. And clearly, the folks who put this together, we're looking at yuppie terrorists at a minimum. They can afford a Mercedes, but they couldn't afford enough money to get a decent class in how to make a bomb that would actually go off.
Or steal one.
Thank God.
Yeah,
Thank God.
Or steal one, as has been implied here by the police. But wait, what does alarm you about this other than the media's kind of nodding head doll coverage of this?
Well, I think the other thing that alarms me about it is that we're so ho-hum when we have this body count piling up every day in Baghdad, where daily there are bombs, car bombs, truck bombs going off, and everyone's like, well, okay, you just get used to it. And you have a non-event in London, and we're going to battle quarters and beginning to give the old hairy eyeball to every Muslim, when it's not even clear yet that all we know is that these were people who could afford a Mercedes. That's the extent of what we know about this so far.
The practical stuff that maybe should be worrisome. Obviously, there are terrorists. There are people who want to do horrific things. No question about any of that. But
Agreed.
The idea that we need to fight the terrorists in Iraq, got to fight them there so they don't follow us here, whatever this was in London today, they were already presumably there, unless this was the graduating Al-Qaeda bomb squad class, which they need remedial work. I mean, does that logic about fighting them there instead of here even hold together slightly tonight?
No, not at all. In fact, what we know is that the U.S. conflict over there, U.S. involvement over there, is aggravating the problem, not calming it. So I think what we need to do is continue to rely upon good intelligence, good police work, but ultimately, neighbors watching out for each other.
Where, besides you, are the skeptics who know what they're talking about in this? Is there a problem with expertise on television about terrorism, that 9 out of 10 guys who come on TV have a vested interest in there being terrorism? Otherwise, their counterterrorism companies wouldn't exist anymore?
Keith, we saw about 3 years ago General Richard Myers, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, say that the threat of terrorism was the greatest threat we faced in this country, in the United States, since the Civil War. And what we know factually is that fewer than 50,000 people, not just Americans, but all people worldwide, have died from international terrorism since 1968. We lose 50 million people plus in World War II, and we have someone like General Myers saying that this is the greatest threat. It's a threat, but we need to put it in its proper perspective and go back and remember the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's the fear. If we allow the fear to conquer us and allow the fear to drive us to do things like allow Guantanamos, like allow torture, then we ourselves become victims to that very thing which we say we're trying to fight. And that's, I think, big deep breaths, remain calm, and let's stop with some of the alarmist behavior.